The three Holt siblings closed on the sale of their father's farm on a Friday afternoon in September 1984. The farmhouse, the outbuildings, and 280 acres of Pittsylvania County, Virginia, sold for $196,000, $700 per acre, which was what good tobacco ground was bringing in that county that year. The three of them split the proceeds after costs, approximately $61,000 each. They drove home separately. It was the kind of closing where nobody lingers. The farm had belonged to their father, who had died the previous winter. None of them had wanted to sell. None of them had seen a way to keep it. That evening, their uncle called. He was their father's younger brother, 71 years old, who had grown up on the same land and had worked it alongside their grandfather as a young man. He had not attended the closing. He had not been part of the decision to sell. He asked one question: "Did any of you know about the allotment?" To understand what the uncle was asking, you have to go back to 1938, not to the Holt family specifically, to what the federal government was doing to American agriculture in 1938, and to a program that would run quietly for the next 6 decades, touching millions of acres of southern farmland, paying annual income to people who sometimes did not know they were receiving it, and creating a class of agricultural asset that existed entirely separate from the land it had originally been attached to. The 1938 Agricultural Adjustment Act was the second iteration of New Deal agricultural reform. The first, passed in 1933, had been struck down by the Supreme Court in 1936 on constitutional grounds. Congress rewrote it. The 1938 version established supply management programs for several major crops: corn, wheat, cotton, and tobacco among them. The tobacco provisions were particularly significant because tobacco was the primary cash crop in a swath of the Upper South that had few economic alternatives, and because tobacco's economics made it uniquely vulnerable to the dynamics that had devastated farm income throughout the 1930s. Tobacco was a labor-intensive, high-value crop that could be grown on relatively small acreages to produce substantial income per acre when prices were favorable. A single acre of good Virginia burley could produce 1,500 to 2,000 pounds of leaf tobacco in a normal year, and at the prices that prevailed in the late 1920s, that acre could generate far more income than an equivalent acre of corn or wheat. The problem was that high value per acre attracted more production, which drove down prices, which hurt all producers simultaneously. A collective action problem in pure form, every individual farmer's rational response to low prices, produce more to maintain total revenue, made the aggregate problem worse. In the 1930s, tobacco prices had collapsed along with the rest of the agricultural economy. Virginia burley prices fell from over 20 cents per pound in the late 1920s to below 10 cents in the early 1930s. The producers who grew it had almost no capacity to manage aggregate supply. An individual farmer who voluntarily cut back production when prices were low simply lost market share, while his neighbors continued growing. The incentive was always to produce more, which collectively made prices worse. Voluntary cooperation was structurally impossible when each defection was individually rational. The quota system was designed to break this cycle by making the limitation mandatory and universal. Under the 1938 Act, USDA assigned a production quota called an allotment to each farm that had historically grown tobacco. The allotment was expressed in pounds of leaf tobacco that the farm was permitted to market in a given year. The initial allotments were calculated from each farm's production history in a base period, typically the 3 to 5 years immediately preceding the program. A farm that had historically grown 8,000 pounds per year received an allotment near that level. A farm that had grown 4,000 pounds received a smaller allotment. The allotments were not equal. They reflected each farm's established production capacity and history. Production above the allotment faced marketing penalties and restrictions that made selling the excess tobacco commercially difficult. Production at or below the allotment received full access to the price support mechanisms of the program, the marketing arrangements and minimum price provisions that the government was willing to backstop. The effect was to cap aggregate national tobacco production at a level that supported prices. By limiting what each farm could sell, the program prevented the collective race to produce more that had depressed prices throughout the 1930s. Tobacco farmers who enrolled received both the restriction, a ceiling on production, and the benefit, a price floor, that moved the crop from distress pricing back toward something that covered production costs. The program was not free. Participating farmers accepted the constraint in exchange for the stability it provided. For the Holt family, the program arrived at a moment when stability was what they most needed. The grandfather had been growing burley tobacco on that Pittsylvania County ground since the late 1920s. He had watched the price collapse. He had watched neighbors take losses that ended careers. When the USDA county agent came around in 1938 to explain the quota system and enroll eligible farms, the grandfather had participated without significant hesitation. He knew what the alternative looked like. The Holt Farm's initial allotment was established based on its production records from the base period, approximately 6,500 pounds of burley tobacco per year. The specific poundage adjusted modestly over subsequent decades as USDA revised national allotment levels in response to market conditions and inventory signals. But the farm carried an allotment continuously from 1938 through the period when something fundamental changed about how those allotments worked. In the early years of the tobacco quota program, an allotment was attached to the farm. If the farm was sold, the allotment went with it. The new owner received the quota along with the land, the buildings, and everything else. An allotment could not be separated from the land to which it was assigned. Congress changed this in stages through the late 1950s and early 1960s. Under revised tobacco program regulations, allotments became leachable and eventually saleable as separate assets. A landowner who held a tobacco allotment could lease the rights to another producer, a neighbor who had more land than allotment, or who wanted to expand production without buying additional acreage. The lessee would pay the allotment holder an annual fee and would market tobacco under the leased quota. Later amendments went further and permitted outright sale of allotments, completely severed from any land transaction. These changes transformed the tobacco allotment from a land attribute into a commodity. It was now something that existed independently, a right to produce and market a specific quantity of tobacco, registered with the USDA, assignable through lease or sale, and valued in the market based on the income it generated and the demand for expanded production among those who needed more quota than their own farms carried. The allotment that the Holt farm carried was approximately 6,500 pounds of burley tobacco per year, established in the program's early years based on the farm's historical production. The specific figure had been adjusted modestly over the decades as USDA revised national allotment levels to respond to market conditions, but the Holt allotment had remained in that range continuously since the late 1930s. In the early years of the program, the Holt family grew tobacco themselves under the allotment. The quota gave them the protected market access and price floor. They harvested their burley crop, cured it in the barn that still stood on the property in 1984, and marketed it through the tobacco auction system in Danville. The allotment was the right that made that marketing possible. Without it, they would have faced penalties and market restrictions on anything they tried to sell. By the late 1950s, the family's own tobacco production had declined. The father was older. His sons were growing up but not committed to staying. The labor requirements of tobacco farming, intensive compared to grain crops, were difficult to meet on a part-time basis. The allotment sat partially unused. In some years, they grew less than their full quota. In those years, the unused pounds simply went to waste. The allotment did not shrink from underuse, but the income it could have generated went unrealized. When the lease option became available in 1963, the father had understood immediately what it meant. He had a neighbor, a man named Bowles, who grew substantial tobacco on his own land and was perpetually constrained by his allotment poundage. Bowles could grow more tobacco than his quota allowed. He needed additional allotment to expand legally. The arrangement was simple. The Holt father would lease his 6,500-pound allotment to Bowles for an annual fee. Bowles would use the allotment to market additional tobacco production. Both parties would benefit. The arrangement was documented in a standard USDA lease form, filed with the county ASC office. The lease renewed each November with minimal paperwork. Bowles sent a check in the spring. The father cashed it and put the money in his personal account because the income belonged to him as the allotment holder, not to the farm's operating account. In his own mind, the allotment was his. He had lived with it for 25 years. He had grown tobacco under it, then leased it, and the lease income was part of his personal financial picture in the same way that any other personal income was distinct from the farm's operational finances, which his children were more aware of. In the early 1980s, allotments in that part of Virginia were leasing at between 55 and 70 cents per pound annually. On 6,500 pounds, that translated to annual lease income of approximately $3,600 to $4,500, depending on the year and on how Bowles and the father adjusted the rate at each annual renewal. By 1983, the year the father died, the lease was generating $4,200 per year. The father had not hidden this income. He had not been secretive about the allotment arrangement. It simply had not come up in any of the conversations he had with his children about the farm, because the conversations about the farm concerned the farm's finances, the operating debt, the land values, the milk prices that were depressing dairy income across Wisconsin, and the grain prices that were making crop farming difficult in Virginia. The allotment lease was his own income, separate and manageable, and he had not made the explicit connection for his children between the paperwork that arrived from the ASC office each November and the concept of an asset with standalone value. When he died in the winter of 1983, the allotment passed to his estate, which his 3 children were administering as co-executors. The lease renewal notice arrived at the farmhouse that November, addressed to the estate. It was one piece of correspondence among many that arrived in the months following his death: insurance documents, bank statements, property tax notices, correspondence from the farm cooperative, equipment warranty cards, feed company mailings. The children were processing this mail as they could, while simultaneously managing the farm's operations through the winter and spring, trying to hold the dairy herd together and make decisions about the estate's direction. The ASC lease renewal notice sat in the pile. It was handled by the estate bank, which received the incoming check from Bowles in the spring and deposited it into the estate account alongside other estate receipts. The bank's statement showed a line item for the deposit. None of the three children had specifically examined that line item and understood what it represented. When they decided to sell the farm in the summer of 1984, no one raised the question of the tobacco allotment. They did not know it was a question that needed raising. The buyer of the Holt farm was a neighbor who had been farming adjacent ground and wanted to consolidate the acreage. He paid $196,000 for the land and buildings. The purchase contract, prepared by a real estate attorney in Chatham, described the property by its legal description: the parcel of land in Pittsylvania County, together with all appurtenances. It did not specifically reference a tobacco allotment. It did not include language conveying any USDA program rights. In 1984 in Virginia, whether a tobacco allotment transferred with a farm sale depended entirely on whether the allotment was explicitly identified and addressed in the purchase contract. An allotment that had been severed from the land, that existed as a separately leased asset generating income that flowed to the individual holder rather than to the land's account, did not automatically transfer with a land sale. It was a personal property right, not a real property appurtenance. The Holt family's allotment had been leased since 1963. For 20 years, the income had gone to their father personally. The allotment was his, not the farm's. It was listed in his personal financial records, not in the farm's accounts. When he died, it passed to his estate, and from the estate it would pass to his heirs, his three children, unless someone decided to sell it as part of the farm, which required specifically including it in the sale. No one had included it. The purchase contract was silent on tobacco allotments. The buyer received 280 acres of Pittsylvania County farmland. He did not receive the right to produce 6,500 pounds of tobacco under the federal quota program. That right remained with the Holt estate. The closing attorney had not raised the allotment question because the allotment had not been mentioned. The siblings' attorney had not raised it because none of them had mentioned it to him. The buyer had not raised it because he was buying land, and if he wanted allotment, he would need to negotiate for it separately, which was common practice in the Virginia tobacco country. He assumed if allotment was available, it would be offered. It was not. The uncle knew about it because he had been there in 1963 when his brother had made the first lease arrangement with the neighbor. He had been sitting at the table when the neighbor came to ask if the allotment was available to lease. He had watched his brother sign the paper. He had helped write the lease amount. He had assumed the siblings knew about it because their father had mentioned it. He had been wrong about that assumption, which is why he was calling on the Friday evening after the closing, when the question he was asking had already become more complicated to answer. The allotment's value at the time of the 1984 closing was approximately $40,000 on the open market. This figure was based on the capitalized value of the annual lease income, approximately $4,200 per year at current lease rates, multiplied by the market multiple that buyers of standalone tobacco allotments were paying in that region, which was typically 9 to 11 times annual income. At 10 times, 6,500 pounds of leased allotment at 65 cents per pound produced a market value between $38,000 and $45,000. The mechanics of that valuation were straightforward. An allotment was worth what someone would pay to acquire the right to produce and market additional tobacco under the federal quota program. A buyer who needed more quota than their own farm carried would calculate what the annual lease cost of renting allotment was and would pay a purchase price that represented the capitalized value of avoiding that annual lease payment. In a stable leasing market at $4,200 per year, with quota available for purchase at 10 times annual income, The allotment was worth approximately $42,000 as a standalone asset. That value existed regardless of what the underlying land was worth. It was not tied to the Pittsylvania County land market. It was tied to the tobacco quota market, which was driven by demand from producers who needed production rights and the supply of available allotments. The siblings had sold the land for $196,000. They had done so without knowing that a separately valued production right worth approximately $40,000 was attached to the estate, an asset that could have been offered to the buyer for an additional payment, sold separately to any tobacco producer in the region who wanted more quota, or simply retained as an ongoing income stream generating $4,200 annually without any labor or management on their part. Their father had known about it. He had not told them, not from secrecy, he was not a secretive man, but from the assumption that people come to understand the assets associated with a farm gradually, through the ordinary process of living with it and managing it. He had managed the allotment for 21 years. It had become unremarkable to him, a routine annual transaction that required filing a standard form in November and depositing a check in April. He had not made the explicit connection for his children between the routine of the lease renewal and the concept of an asset with a market value that existed independently of the land. They had not asked about it. The opportunity to explain it had never presented itself in a context where it seemed relevant. The uncle had known about it from the beginning. He had been in the room in 1963 when Bowles first came to ask about leasing. He had watched his brother negotiate the first rate and file the first form. He had assumed across 21 years that his brother had eventually told his children. That assumption had never been tested until the Friday evening phone call. The closing attorney had not asked about it. In a straightforward farm sale in 1984, a real estate attorney in rural Virginia was focused on the land transaction, title search, survey review, lien clearances, deed preparation, and closing mechanics. An agricultural program rights audit, a specific inquiry into what USDA program entitlements were registered to the farm or the farm's owner, was not a standard component of a land closing unless the parties specifically requested it. No one had. The allotment was in the USDA County Agricultural Stabilization and Conservation Service records for Pittsylvania County, correctly indexed under the farm's operator of record. Anyone who walked into the ASCS office and asked for a search of the program history associated with that farm would have found it within an hour. No one had walked in and asked. The siblings' position after the uncle's call required untangling several things simultaneously, and the untangling was not painful so much as it was disorienting. They had just completed a transaction they understood to be comprehensive. They had sold the farm. They had received their shares. They had considered the estate substantially resolved. The uncle's call reopened it. The three of them met the following Tuesday at the farmhouse, which was no longer theirs, though the closing had been recent enough that it still felt like it, and went through their father's files in the cabinet in the back room together for the first time. They found the lease arrangement exactly where the uncle had described it. A thin folder of annual renewal forms, each dated in November, each countersigned by Bowles, going back to 1963. 21 years of consistent, documented, quietly generating income. The most recent renewal, dated November 1983, was made out to the estate of Robert Holt, their father's name on the line, where his signature had previously appeared. They found the spring payment record as well, a deposit slip from the estate bank account, dated April 1984, for $4,200. It had been deposited 5 months before the farm sale closed, It was sitting in the estate account along with other estate receipts, unremarked on by any of them during the months of estate administration because none of them had stopped to ask what it was. An estate attorney in Chatham, retained the following week, confirmed what the uncle had described. The allotment was personal property under Virginia law, a USDA program, right registered to the holder, separate from any real property interests. Because it was personal property, it had passed to the estate when their father died, and from the estate it would be distributed to the three heirs in equal shares, just as the farm sale proceeds choice were. The allotment had not been included in the farm sale contract. It had not been conveyed to the buyer. It remained with the estate and therefore with the heirs. The ongoing lease arrangement could continue under the estate's authority until the heirs decided what to do with the allotment. They had three options. They could continue leasing it to Bowles at the current rate, collecting $4,200 annually, and deferring any decision about sale. They could offer it to the buyer of the farm, the neighbor who had purchased the land, as a separate transaction at market price, or they could sell it on the open allotment market, either directly to another tobacco producer in the region or through a broker who handled these transactions. The siblings eventually sold the allotment to the same neighbor who had been leasing it for 2 years past the farm sale. He paid $38,500, slightly below the open market estimate, reflecting his preference to own what he had been renting and the siblings' preference for a clean transaction without a brokered sale process and the time it would require. Each sibling received approximately $12,800 from that second transaction on top of the $61,000 from the farm sale. The total for each, approximately $73,800. If the allotment had been included in the original farm sale negotiation, identified, valued, and offered to the buyer as part of the package, it would likely have been valued at market and added to the purchase price, or negotiated separately at closing. The buyer might have paid $235,000 for land and allotment together, or the allotment might have been separately offered to Bowles or to any other allotment buyer in the county while the land went to the neighbor. Either way, the value was there. It had always been there. It had been generating income for 21 years. The buyer might have paid $235,000 rather than $196,000. Or the allotment might have been sold separately to a third party for its full market value while the land went to the neighbor. Either way, the value was there. It had always been there. It had been generating income for 21 years. The tobacco allotment system the New Deal created in 1938 persisted in modified forms until Congress finally eliminated it in 2004 as part of the Fair and Equitable Tobacco Reform Act. For 66 years, it assigned production rights to American tobacco farmers, created a floor under tobacco prices, and generated annual income streams that attach first to farms and then, after the 1960s regulatory changes, to individuals and estates as separately held assets. During those 66 years, tobacco allotments became an invisible inheritance for thousands of families in the Upper South. Invisible not because they were hidden, but because they were registered in a government database that nobody thought to search, generating income in amounts small enough to be overlooked in estate paperwork, and structured in a way that most farm families and most real estate attorneys who did not specialize in agricultural transactions did not think to address during a farm sale. The decision made in 1938, when USDA assigned a production allotment to the Holt farm based on its tobacco growing history, created an asset that would separate from the land 2.5 decades later change hands without anyone noticing during a 1984 farm sale and require a 71-year-old uncle's phone call to surface at all. 46 years between the assignment and the consequence. 6,500 pounds of tobacco per year leased to a neighbor, generating $4,200 annually, worth $40,000 on the open market. The land sold for $700 per acre. The allotment was not land. Production rights are not land.